Chapter 3 First Test. The landing was less than eloquent, but they were all alive. Havilah looked around where she found herself and saw no one. Her objective was plainly spelled out: find a weapon and use it. She was more than capable of handling survival situations on her own. Her ears twitched looking for any sign of Grim, and then began walking. Her eyes went from stone to dying plant looking for anything she could find use of. It reminded her of the life she had just been invited to leave behind. The irony of it all amused her. Her tail began to twitch and alerted her of a presence nearby. The grunting of a Borbatusk was just as familiar as the isolation she found herself in. Her knife came to her hands in a guard attempting to ward off the beast. It wasn't intimidated and took the gesture as a challenge. Rolling into a wheel of blades, it charged her down. More than accustomed to the predictable patterns of attack the creatures of Grim followed, she waited until the very last moment and stood aside, allowing the beast to slam itself into a rock and knocking itself unconscious. These beasts didn't sleep, but she knew the disorientation would buy her time. She kicked the Borbatusk over and drove the knife into the center of its belly. It disintegrated without even a groan in response to the mortal wound she delivered. Observing the shards of rocks the monster's impact had scattered, she picked a few of the smaller and sharper pieces up and placed them into her pockets. Of all the material she had on her person, she was glad they hadn't worn down over the last few months. Growing up within walls always had clothes provided for her when she needed them. On her own, the simple comforts of clothing were just one more thing to find, apart from water. She didn't know how the person she had found them on had ended up in the way she found them in, but it was the only part of the woman's body that was recognizable as human. Whether she had been eaten, mauled, or crushed, it wasn't her problem anymore. She was afraid then. She still was now, but she wasn't going to cry again. She wouldn't let other people get hurt over her fragile psyche. This weakness was like the now non-existent beast she had disemboweled. Once its underside was exposed, it was more vulnerable than she was to a head-on charge. Odd how even these beasts found balance in their design. Living tools of death, who all hold vital weaknesses that she had seen exploited so casually by the soldiers who fought in the Great War. It was almost something to be thankful for, that the only thing they had to worry about were the Grim again. People were a greater threat than they could ever hope to be. She looked at her hands, in which she realized they had just stopped shaking. This confrontation must have been more jarring to her than she realized. At least she didn't panic. Clutching her fists, she realized there was another place of balance found in people. Faunus or not, they had emotions that could motivate them as easily as they could become their death sentences. The question remained to be answered when that strength would become a weakness. She turned her ears again, thinking she heard another Grim, but the sound wasn't hostile. It was one of the few things that made her smile. With a sigh of relief, she began to walk towards its source. "Water,"